Welcome to Week 8. Just 3 articles to go over this week. Let's go ahead and dig in. Kim and Duda, 2009, wrote an article called Studying Crisis Communication from the Subaltern Studies Framework. Grassroots activism in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. This article suggests an alternative approach that communication researchers can use to kind of expand the scope of the literature to something other than in a managerial context. They're trying to discuss or speak to the discursive nature of crisis communication and also attend to the issues of structure and agency in the interpretations of response to crisis. They call this framework subaltern, thinking about marginalized publics who do not have access or easy access to public infrastructures and resources, but they're often the ones who are hit hardest during a natural disaster. And so oftentimes these voices of these people are largely absent from the dominant discourse of crisis. We typically look at the organization through the lens of media and stakeholders. Oftentimes, most times, these authors argue, they don't include people whose voices are not heard, what they call the subaltern. The authors suggest a different approach, an alternative way to kind of rupture the dominant logic of crisis communication by bringing it under scrutiny. They argue that this rupturing creates openings for listening to others and other ways of interpreting crisis. And they emphasize the deconstructive turn. Some questions that they ask I thought would be helpful for us to discuss. One, why do we not treat public relations itself as the message and expose its fundamental cultural and ideological assumptions? We get comfortable in the way we do things, and it's sometimes good to turn it around and look at ourselves as public relations practitioners or communicators and see what we can learn, especially from perspectives that we're not familiar with or may not represent our organization. Another question, what if we simultaneously decentered the role of the organization, seriously modified our ideas about technical rationality, and gave up on some of our objectives in order to bring diverse audiences in line with a dominant view of the organization? Again, turning around the way we normally do business and making sure that there are not audiences for which we have not accounted. That's the Kim and Duda article, 2009. Next article is Liu and Pomper, 2012, The Crisis with No Name, Defining the Interplay of Culture, Ethnicity, and Race on Organizational Issues and Media Outcomes. They use complexity theory as their framework, and they study as an in-depth or theoretically grounded understanding of managing issues and crisis involving culture, ethnicity, and race. Things that usually don't get covered when we talk about crisis communication. It's one of the reasons I like this article. They conducted 34 in-depth interviews with senior crisis communicators, and then they use that to find suggestions for practical applications for crisis managers. Now, one word of caution. When I heard that they were interviewing or read that they were interviewing senior crisis communicators, I automatically suspect that those senior crisis communicators do not represent a diverse set of people. Most likely, those 34 senior crisis communicators represent white men. And so it's important, as you dig into that article, to see how they address that. Were they able to find senior crisis communicators represented in their study, or in their study that represented a more fair and more objective view from different viewpoints, especially when you're studying something like culture, ethnicity, and race. And then a final note about that article, your authors are quoted as saying, resonant among voices of research participants was an urging for crisis communicators to move beyond any managerial bias. Again, if you're talking about managers, leaders, especially senior managers, senior leaders, how do we get out of the white male dominance that is in our society if we want to better understand underrepresented voices. And your authors try to develop an expanded sensitivity and worldview beyond a typical comfort zone for a white male, someone who is usually seen as the senior leader in an organization. Okay. Oh, and then the final thing, they want to make sure that they look at all constituents. Okay, and these things don't happen on their own. So if you're in an organization and you want to reach a diverse audience, don't automatically assume it's going to just happen. Unless you're blessed to be in an organization with a lot of diverse viewpoints, a lot of different cultures, races, genders, etc., don't assume that it's going to happen. And even if you are blessed to be in an organization with a lot of diversity, you still want to be proactive in terms of your communication and making sure that that communication reaches all the diverse audiences that are necessary. Okay, final article for the week is Falkheimer and Hyde, Multicultural Crisis Communication Towards a Social Constructivist or Constructionist Perspective. The one thing I'll tell you about these three articles, they throw out a lot of theory and a lot of fancy sounding words. Don't get hung up with those. They're interesting, and if you're interested in a specific aspect, by all means dig a little deeper. We're more interested in the practical applications of that, so you can apply that theory in a practical way. The aim of the article is to give a critical analysis of research that has been done on crisis communication, as well as some intercultural, easy for you to say, intercultural public relations, in order to develop a differential theoretical framework. Your authors acknowledge that we live in a society that is ethnically diverse and increasingly multicultural. When it comes to crisis communication, case studies have shown that ethnic differences seem to escalate during crisis. Think about some of those crises that we studied just this term, especially those that had anything to do with different cultures or races. That can escalate very, very quickly. And if you think about it, it makes sense. If you're from two different cultures, the communication can sometimes be a little bit confusing. What people from a similar culture understand innately is not necessarily overtly understood when you talk about a difference in cultures. And so that's why it's important for you to understand as a communicator how other cultures, people with different worldviews, may view your communication and may or may not understand what you are trying to communicate. And finally, your authors note that crises often result from poor communication. We know that, right? That's why we study communication in the context of crisis. But that communication between organizations and the public, it's got to be crystal clear. It's got to be crystal clear, and it's not crystal clear if you don't account for different cultures, races, worldviews, etc. And again, these communication problems, they tend to be intensified in a multicultural context. So think about that. Think about that in terms of your own organization. Think about that in terms of what we've learned throughout this time together. And most importantly, think about how it might influence your future communication. Even if you don't think you have a multicultural audience, in today's connected world, automatically assume that your communication is going to be heard, read, otherwise consumed by a multicultural audience. It's the right thing to do. All right, this last week, it's as important as ever. Stay ahead with all your assignments, stay engaged in that discussion board, and please, please, please enjoy your time of learning.